G'day, welcome to Pay It Forward. Now today's project was inspired by a couple of pieces of fabric, which often happens with me. My daughter Memphis found a couple of rolls of fabric in our local thrift store, brought them around to me, and immediately I just saw a beautiful Duck Lovey. You'll see what I mean when you see him all up close. A beautiful soft pattern for a child to love and to hug, or you can make it as an interior doll. They look fantastic lying on a bed. That's where this little one is going to live. And you need to choose some lovely soft fabrics. This is a soft velour upholstery fabric in the two colours which inspired me to make this one. So your free pattern is available in the drop down description box below. All you need to do is click on that link and it will open up your pattern templates. Do read the blurb that I give you there and it will tell you about printing out those templates. Also, check the measuring bar that I've put on every page so that you're making sure those pattern pieces are correct. So let's get busy now making a beautiful little Duck Lovey. Now let's take a look at what we're going to need. Let me show you your pattern pieces for making our flat out duck. We are starting with the body pieces. The main body pieces I have cut from an interfaced upholstery fabric. Now your fabric choices in this project are really important. I wouldn't make it out of just normal quilting cottons. You need something that's got a little bit of substance, but you also need something that's nice and soft. My daughter Memphis actually found these fabrics for me in a thrift store. It's an upholstery fabric and you can see that it's super flexible. It's kind of velvety. It's still got a weave that we can see, and it still took the interfacing well. You do need to interface the main body of this project, and I'm going for the colours of a mallard duck, but just really subdued. So it's got an indication of a mallard, but of course you can make yours up in any colour at all. But a fabric that's got some softness and flexibility and still can be interfaced is really good. You can make this up in a fleece fabric, will make up well too. Okay, so those are our two side body pieces. We have a centre gusset. These are all interfaced with my fusible woven cotton interfacing. Make sure it's a woven cotton interfacing for soft sculpture. This is the back of the bottom piece, also cut from that same fabric, and I'm keeping all of that section that same dead pink browny sort of a colour. So let's move on to the head. So the head is made up of our two side head pieces. This is the same fabric, only in a green, which is where I got the inspiration for the duck. So again, all these pieces are interfaced. Two side head pieces and an underneath gusset piece. Then we have our beak. Now your beak, you can make that out of your normal quilting cotton. That'll give you a nice sharp, clean beak. You could also make it out of interfaced felt. So we have our beak pieces, which will just sit in like this. So there's no joints in this project because it's a lovey and it needs to be completely and totally soft. And this is the underside piece. Again, all interfaced. Move those head pieces out the way. We are going to look at the legs. So for the legs in this project, you're going to need some stretch knit fabric. This is a spandex, and it's in the same colour family. I would have liked it a little bit more orange, but I'm going to work with what I have. This is a 4-way stretch. I've folded it over right sides together and simply traced around my leg templates, because this is a really easy project when you're so right on the line, rather than trying to pin fiddly pieces together. And this is a great trick for when you are using stretch fabric. I've thrown a couple of pins in just to stop the fabrics from slipping. So likewise, that's the same way that we make the wings. So the wings I've done in my two colours. The green is going to be on the underside. I'm going to have the fleshy colour on top, but it'd be nice to see that little bit of green on the underneath. So again, I've just traced around them. Now if you're using fabrics that are light and you might see that through, just use a heat erasable marker. Mine are so thick you're not going to see those lines. We're going to stitch straight over the top of that and then cut them out. So I've got those all pinned up and ready to sew. I'm also adding 2 little black buttons for eyes, which will allow me to pull the eyes in a little. If you're making it for an absolute infant, then just do an embroidery stitched eye. That's your safest. You could, I mean, it would be possible to do safety eyes, but you'd have to attach them before you even put the head together, and then you're just not going to get them in the right place. So I would suggest embroidering an eye or using buttons if the child is not at chewing age. Okay, you'll need a bit of pearl thread just to do a couple of little nostrils on the beak. I'm going to be adding around the top part of the bottom, right at the top, a little bit of this gingham braid, which is going to just give the idea of a little bit of a tail feather ruffle, not too much. This project is all about clean lines, but I did think that would look really sweet given the colours. And I'm also going to be adding just around the neck a little lace trim to give it the indication of that white, off-white band that mallards have, but it's also adding a little bit of that little scalloped edge, which will be really nice. This is a stretch lace. You don't have to have stretch lace, but this one will work really well. We're going to be filling with polyester filling. If you want it just to be a bed sitter for home decor, you can put some weight in it, as I will at the base, with either plastic pellets, or you could use some fine aquarium gravel. You could even use clean dry rice if you're not living in a humid sort of a climate. Otherwise you'll have soggy rice. Okay, so let's begin. Now, to begin this project, we start actually with our wings and our legs, because they're incorporated into the project. So they're both done in the same way. So for this one, I'm going to take it to my machine. I have a Microtex really fine needle in. You can use a ballpoint needle as well. If you haven't done any stretch sewing before, just get a ballpoint needle in your machine and it'll make things so much easier. So what we're going to do is we are going to just stitch. You really need to back and forth on the start and finish here of each of them. We leave the end open. We're going to stitch exactly on that line with both of them. And then we're going to do the same with the wings. I'm going to leave this section open for turning. I'm going to stitch exactly on the line all the way around. When you go to cut them out, you can cut this one out with only about a 2mm seam allowance around it, because it's a stretch fabric, it's lycra. But mine is really tightly woven, so if your fabric has more fray to it, give yourself a slightly larger seam allowance when you're cutting out. And the same with this one. It'll depend on your fabric. This one does fray away a lot more, so I'm going to be a little more generous with my seam allowance when I cut it out. When I do cut it out, I cut right on that line there and then leave the seam allowance around the rest. And the same with this one. I cut straight across the opening line and then add that seam allowance. So obviously match up your thread colours. I'm using 100% polyester Gutermann thread in my machine. And in general, I have my machine stitch length set to a number 2 for all of my sewing. Sometimes on your stretch fabrics, you will need to lift that to a 2.5. Do a little test and see how you go. Now let me show you those legs. This is one of the little legs all completed. This is one that I've just cut out. I just need to turn it through. Now the reason why we use the stretch fabric with these is that it makes it so much easier for turning through. And in fact, these probably wouldn't turn through with most fabrics, but we want a nice fine little leg. So forceps help us do that, and of course because it's stretch, it'll stretch over itself. And you want to really push out all of those lovely little webbed toes all the way out. And then we add some filling, but not very much. the idea is that it's all nicely soft and cuddly. This really is intended to be a child's cuddle doll. So there we go. We only need to add just a tiny little bit of filling. You'll see this one's really soft. And the reason why, the other reason why I use a stretch knit for this is because it won't look lumpy. If you use just a normal cotton, you'll have a lumpy look. This is lovely and soft. So I'm just going to lightly fill this, and I'm going to stop about 1.5 centimetres from the end, and then I'm going to just stitch across. So that's all secure and ready to go into our little duck. And with the wings that I have here, we've got our 2 wings already turned through. I've given them a press, and then I've just zigzag closed those openings. Particularly for me, I used a zigzag stitch to close it because my fabric is fraise. I don't know if I mentioned, I hope I did mention that with the wings, depending on your fabric, I don't interface the wings, but my fabric's really quite plushy. Okay, so you might need to interface them if you're using a much lighter weight fabric. Okay, but I like the softness of that. All right, now let's get started on the body. So the body and the head on this project are all connected, so there's no joints. So it's very quick and easy to make. So we're going to start working on the bottom gusset that lies flat on your tabletop or the bed. And we have our 3 pieces. We have the underside of the beak, underside of the head, and the underside of the duck itself. So what we want to do is we want to take our pieces and we want to put right sides together, and you can see you've got marks on your pattern pieces, and do make sure that you're attaching the beak to the beak end. They look similar but they're not the same, so mark it on your pattern piece. I've got it on your templates. So we're going to line that one up, and we're going to overcast that, and then we're going to stitch that seam, 4mm seam allowance, 2 times. Then we're going to take that assembled 2 pieces, we're going to put right sides together, do the same thing, line it all up, and we're going to sew that one 2 times. Now, once I've done that, I will remove my overcasting stitch, and I will press both of those seams flat, open and flat, because it means all of our joins, because there's a couple of joins along there, we want a nice clean line around that neck through the colour change. It's much easier if you've pressed those seams open and flat. So many people don't use their iron in sewing, and it's so incredibly important for great finish. Now, as I said, I have pressed those 2 seams out nice and flat, and that's all sitting lovely. Now we're going to take our wing pieces, and do make sure that the little scalloped edge of the wing is facing towards the bottom. You've got marks on your pattern template that show you where these wings go. So they tuck right in here, in between those 2 marks, right in the middle. You want to go ahead and just within the seam allowance, just stay stitch those in place on each side, so that when we actually sew the seam of putting the body together, those wings will be incorporated into the seam. So just stay within the seam allowance and make sure that you've definitely incorporated all of the edge of the wing. So this is how your assembled lower gusset should look. Remember that I've got the green on the underside of the wings, so when it's all made up, the pinky fleshy tone will be on top. All right, we can put this one aside, and we're going to start working on our side pieces. First thing I've done is I've sewn a zigzag stay stitch across each of the opening pieces, so that when we go to close it up and when we're stuffing it, it won't be fraying away, particularly with my fabric. So those are our side pieces, and we are going to be adding, just as we did with the gusset, we're going to be adding our head pieces and and our beak pieces. Again, make sure that you're putting them on the right way. Each of those. So we're going to do exactly the same thing. You're going to put right sides together. You're going to fit those curves together. You'll find when you do that, that you've got your tiny points are extending. That's absolutely fine because it allows for your seam allowance, so don't think that it's wrong. And you're going to hand stitch that with your overcasting thread first, just tack it into place, and then you can sew that on the machine, and then you do the same thing with the side of the head, and then you repeat with these 3 pieces. Again, I'm going to open up those seams and I'm going to press them all flat. Okay, so now I have both of my side body pieces assembled, and as I said, I have opened and pressed the seams out on both of those. Okay, and you'll see why we do that now. We're going to put right sides together of these two, and we're going to start at the beak, the very tip of the beak, and you can use clips or pins or whatever works best. I find clips work best, particularly for these sections. Now this is where it's important to open up those seams because we need these 2 junctions to meet perfectly, which means the 2 seams need to meet perfectly. And I find that a clip works best to clamp them together. So what we're doing here is we are going to be overcasting and we're going to be sewing the top centre seam, but this is our opening that we're going to be stuffing and turning through. So we need to leave this. So you're going to clip, and remember this junction 2 needs to be met up perfectly as well. And you are going to do your overcasting and up to the tail, and then you're going to sew that seam, 4mm seam allowance, 2 times, and really back and forth on your start and finish of that opening. So once you've sewn that centre seam, you can go ahead. I like to remove my overcasting stitch from it because for the same reason I can flatten the seam out and you'll get a better top seam finish. And then I take my time to really roll that seam out all the way down to the front of the beak, especially on these seam meetings. Make sure they have all connected up well as they have. So our next step is going to be, well, for me, if you want to add your little bit of frill on the back section, which will be the top of the little tail that indicates tail feathers, I've given you some marks on your pattern pieces that show you from where to put that. And I'm simply going to stitch that on just within the seam allowance and snip that off, and it's just enough so when it is turned through, there's going to be that little tuft of, you know, the little gathering that looks like little tail feathers. You certainly don't have to add that, just an extra if you want to. Okay, so that has my little tail feather ruffle in place, and now we are going to add that lower gusset, body gusset, to our assembled side body pieces. So we're going to take the very front of the beak on the underside. I'm just going to open up my seam there, and I want to take my pin straight through the centre and be sure that that's completely lined up. And you'll notice that I'm working actually on the gusset. Now, the next point that has to line up perfectly is these 2 here, either side, just the same way that we line them up on the top. So you want to be taking that top edge, lining it up, pin through all your layers, flip it over, take a little bit up on the other side, push your pin head all the way down, and you want to pull that in until those 2 meet perfectly so that your beak is a very clean finish all the way around. I'm going to continue on with that. I'm going to really make sure that is anchored in, and then I'm just going to continue on. These 2 have to match up as well, and then as I go I'm just simply going to pin and overcast this all the way down to the base, and of course I'm making sure that the little wing is tucked in there as well, and that everything is incorporated there, that wing is nicely out of the way. And then I'm going to pin and overcast the other side the same, and then you can machine stitch that whole piece. And remember, it's still a 4mm seam allowance, and you do need to sew it 2 times, and make sure you go over this wing section a couple of times, particularly on the edges, so that they're not pulling out, and make sure all of that wing edge is nicely incorporated in your seam. You may have to enlarge your seam to about 5mm as you go over that section. I now have the base gusset all stitched in beautifully to the side pieces of our duck, so everything is nice and neat and tidy, and all of these junctions are lined up. If you find it difficult to sew this section on the machine, you can certainly sew that in by hand. I did with a stab back stitch. Now we're going to add, we're not going to turn it through at this stage because we still have to add the bottom. And the bottom, I've taken those legs that we've already made, and I've just stitched them into place within my seam allowance on the right side of the fabric with the feet pointing towards the top end. Just stitch them into place temporarily. Okay, you've got marks on your pattern templates that show you where the side of the leg starts. And now we are going to tuck those little legs in there, and we're going to find our center point and take a pin all the way through my center point, that 4mm seam allowance, straight through the center seam. And then I'm just going to work my way around, and I will be going from side to side. Pinning in 3D here, so what we're doing is taking our pin through all of those layers, flipping it over and just taking a little bit of fabric up on the other side and pushing the pin head all the way down, so we're actually pinning it into that 3D shape. I'm going to make sure that my ruffle is pulled out so I won't have any raw edges left there, and you'll find that this piece will fit in perfectly. You've also got a center mark here that you can line up with the gusset piece, and then fit in all the way around those curves. You can see that's going to fit in beautifully. Get that all pinned into place and then overcast it into place. I will then show you my stab back stitch that I do on this top edge, because this is a bit tricky, it's quite a few layers. I'll show you that same back stitch that I did on the underside of my beak. So that bottom section is all overcast in place and our pins are gone, makes it much easier for us to sew it. And I'm just going to show you how I sew this top curve. So I start down here, just a little way down on my straight edge, and come in from the underneath. I've got a single strand of extra strong thread in a matching colour, and I'm going to first just make 2 stitches to start with, one right on top of the other. And you can also do this on the bottom curves if you find that a bit tricky to get around on the machine, and then you can link it all up with your machine sewing. So this is a stab back stitch. I've got a video of this on my channel here, but I will show you. I'm taking a slightly deeper seam allowance because of that ruffle around the top there, and I don't want to miss any of it. So I've just come up, I've travelled the length of 1 stitch from the underneath, and I'm going to go back into the last exit hole and pull those stitches nice and firm, keep them nice and even. Each time I'm going back into that last exit hole, so you can't go wrong because you are linking those stitches.
That way those stitches are sewn back and front, just like a sewing machine does, only we only need to sew this. If we sew anything by hand, using this stitch and extra strong thread, we only need to sew it once. When you do your link up sewing on the machine, sew those twice. And I have switched out my needle for a jeans needle. I do most of my sewing with a jeans needle. Lots of layers to get through in this project, and of course some will be tougher than others depending on what you're using. If you're making this in fleece, it's quite an easy, quick make. In saying that, if you are making it in fleece, you still need to make sure that beak section is made in a more stable fabric so that it holds its shape well. So you can see I'm getting the perfect line there. I'm just going to continue up and finish off about the same distance down on the other side. When I get to the center here, I'm going to do 2 stitches either side to really lock that center point in. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew, and remember to do all of your sewing, pinning and overcasting working on this back piece. Don't do it from the side pieces. So I'll go ahead and I will stitch all the way around, and make sure that you go back and forth a couple of times over those little leg areas so that they're held in really secure. Go right ahead and turn your beautiful duck through the right way, and you find that it'll all pull out through here. I start from the legs and then pull the rest of the body and the wings through. They certainly help you pull it through. And go ahead now, and it's really important you roll out all of those seams over the whole doll, and then you've got that lovely, I really do think that little frill is lovely. It's a lovely finishing touch. We are now going to go ahead and fill this little one, and I will be adding a little bit of weight in the bottom of mine, just because mine will just only ever be sitting flat on a bed or something like that, so won't be actually used as a lovey. If you're just making it for a child to cuddle, you can just fill it softly with your polyester filling. In saying that, you need to fill from about here forward really firm, and that's going to keep that head nice and solid. Also, when you do that, if you want to stop that filling from falling into the softer padded area, fill up to a certain point, and then particularly you could do it through this section here. Just take a needle, a doll needle with some extra strong thread, and just go through and across hatchway through and create like a little web on the inside. If you imagine a little web of thread inside, then lose the thread into the actual doll itself. That will stop that filling ever coming out of this area, and it'll allow you to have nice and firm there and nice and soft here. If we had jointed that head, we wouldn't have to worry about that. But because it's all in one piece, you do want that head and that beak to stay lovely and firm and retain its shape. Okay, so that's just a little tip for you. Okay, so I'm going to take my forceps and I'm going to start way up here at the beak, and I'm going to really fill that out. I'm also going to concentrate on keeping that lovely shape of the beak, so I want to flatten the tip out, and I can do that with my forceps. And also we're going to be adding the eyes, so you need a nice firm head so that when we pull those eyes in, the whole head isn't going to collapse. And similarly, if you're going to add some nostrils, I'm not sure about that yet. I'll see when it's done. If you want to add nostrils, of course, that beak also needs to be nice and firm. So I'm just going to continue on. I will do a little bit of that cross hatching through here on mine. And for a little bit of weight for mine, I'm just going to add some loose aquarium gravel. Again, this will never be touched by a child in that way. And I'll settle that nicely in the bottom and then pile my polyester filling on top. It just means it'll sit really flat on his belly. Once you get to the top here, you want to take your wool felting needle and tuck all of that filling in. Then we're going to come back and just close that opening with a ladder stitch. Okay, so now I have my little duck all filled. You can see absolutely solid through here, right to here. I've done my crosshatch stitching through that neck, and then it softens off, and now the rest is quite squishy, but it's still holding out all that lovely shape and form, and I have a little bit of weight in the base. All right, so I've tucked everything in. I've got just enough room to close that opening. I've got a matching extra strong thread, single strand, whole pile of knots in the end, and we are going to close this opening. So the way we do that, we bring our needle in at our seam allowance of about 4 millimeters, right where the seam starts to open out, and that little bunch of knots is going to hold nicely. I'm going to take that thread straight across, so straight across parallel. I'm going to dive in the other side and just travel down the length of what will be one stitch in my seam allowance. So one stitch going across. Then we're going to travel back over, and I'm going to go into that first hole where we entered, where that knot is underneath, and I'm going to travel down one stitch on this side. I'm going to give it a squeeze and a pull in. I'm going to travel back across, and I'm going to find the last exit hole from the last stitch, and again travel down, a squeeze and a pull in, so that we're pulling those edges in together with every stitch. This is called a ladder stitch, and I have a video on this particular stitch right here on my channel that you can check out. But it's quite straightforward. Things to remember are keeping your stitches nice and small and even. You have to travel down the same each side. So you don't want to take a bigger stitch one side, a smaller stitch this side. You'll end up with puckering at the bottom. So you want to travel down evenly, and you also want to always squeeze in and pull those stitches together. They'll relax a little when you go to do your next stitch, but it's got some memory, and it will pull in again. If you just do it loose and then try and pull on those threads further down, it's never going to knit together well. So you can see I'm just going to continue on. Another tip with this, if you don't have the exact matching thread colour, choose a darker colour rather than a lighter colour. A darker colour will always be more invisible because it is naturally in that seam in a recess, so dark is more invisible. So I'm going to just continue on. I'm going to cast off when I get to the bottom. I'm just going to take a little surface knot right here in the seam, dive my needle back in, and it will be hidden completely. Now let's add our little duck's eyes. I have actually chosen my eye placement with my eye tester pins, which I've got here. Try and keep the eye size, the buttons that you're going to use, if you're using buttons, keep them to around about sort of 8 to 9 millimeters, not bigger than that. It'll look a little odd. Remember that this whole project is supposed to be very, very simple and understated. So I have my eyes ready. I've chosen my placement, and I have popped a mark there on each side. I've got my extra strong thread in black, and I have a knot in the end. I'm just going to make that a big pile of knots. I need to be able to sink that underneath. So first of all, I'm going to come in from the underneath, and I'm aiming to come out right on that mark. So I've come in from the underside and sunk that knot into the fabric underneath, brought my needle out on one of my eye spots. I'm going to come in the back of that button and then back through again. I'm going to take my needle in just the other side of that mark, and then I'm going to do the same across the other side. So I've just travelled straight through the head. And I want to make sure everything is gone in and not twisted. I'm going to get the second button in place. back into the head. I'm going to go back through and find the other hole again. And then I'm going to go back through the other one, and I'm going to pass through those buttons about 3 or 4 times and giving it a good squeeze in as I do, because I really do want them to pull in because it gives a little bit more definition to the head. It can be a little bit tricky finding that hole, but there it is. It's actually easier than you might think, finding that hole, but you can see I can give them a squeeze and pull in on that and keep up that tension. And I'm going to keep that tension up as I'm passing through those 3 or 4 times. When I'm finished, I'm going to come out at the back, at the base of the neck there, cast off with a surface knot, and that will be done. So there we go, that completes my beautiful little duck, my flat out duck. I've added just a little lace collar. Mine is elastic lace, so I just made a little loop, pulled it straight over her head. You can secure that with a couple of stitches if you like. You can see those gorgeous eyes. Isn't that face just absolutely lovely? Now you can add nostrils. It's my executive decision on mine not to. I love the simplicity of this. I love that very prairie look. This one is going to be perfect for my bed because it matches all of my bedding. So that's probably where she'll live. If you are going to make this for a child for an actual lovey to cuddle, of course you can leave the weight out, pad it really, really soft. Remember to keep these wings nice and soft. Just make sure that this head section is packed firm, so you'll find that little kids will tend to hang on to them by their neck and cart them around. The little dangly legs are lovely, and as is that little frill. So bear in mind fabrics such as minky plush, even a really, really short pile fur would work. But of course keep your beak the same and the legs the same. Anything that's soft and lovely to cuddle, fleece would be absolutely beautiful. And get creative with this. You could also make this up in calico and have it as an interior doll for home decor. You could enlarge or decrease the pattern, and you can have 3 ducks lying there together. Just a beautiful, simple concept, and I know you're going to have fun with it. You could add embroidery, all sorts of embellishments. As I said, mine's just going to sit nicely on my bed. I hope you find this pattern really useful, and most of all, that you've enjoyed it.
So I hope that's encouraged you all to go and check out your local thrift stores. There are beautiful fabrics to be found, and you know that's what I'm all about, upcycling and thrifting and using them to create something, giving it new life. I love to do that, so go and check those out. And I think a lot of you will probably be able to just dive into your stash with this one and make up something wonderful. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I had so much fun making this one, and also I don't know how that happened. This fabric just inspired a mallard duck, so that's just the way it goes sometimes. I've also dropped for you the little duckling that goes with my masterclass, April masterclass, the little pig. I've given you the little duckling right here on Pay It Forward as well, so you'll be able to make a couple of little ducks, bit of a duck month this month. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing it, and I hope you find it very, very useful. It's not often that I do something that's really particularly just a child's companion, a lovely cuddly thing, but this one is definitely it. This one will live on my bed and blends nicely with my decor. So I would love to see these made up in different sizes as interior dolls. They would look fantastic made up, as I said in the video, in calico. So looking forward to seeing your results. As always, everybody have a fantastic creative week, and remember to pay all those good things forward. Until next time, it is hooroo from me.